Laughter rolled across the marble hall the moment Preston Vale lifted Caleb Danner's hand into the light and asked the room, loud enough for every camera to catch it, where a maintenance technician had bought a fake Navy SEAL ring. Billionaires, generals, and defense executives turned to stare at the quiet man in the plain gray uniform, certain he was trying to steal a kind of honor that did not belong to him. Caleb said nothing. He simply drew his hand back and closed his fingers over the scratched silver band, the way he had done 1,000 times before, in rooms far more dangerous than this one. Nobody in that hall knew what the ring had cost, or who had given it to him, or what he had promised the day he put it on. Then the doors at the far end of the room opened, and the President of the United States walked in, and instead of greeting the men waiting in line to shake his hand, he walked straight past all of them toward Caleb and said quietly that he had finally found the man who once saved every person in that room without any of them ever knowing his name. If you want to know why the president refused to shake anyone else's hand that day, and what that scratched ring had been hiding for 14 years, stay with this story until the very end, because the truth behind it will change how you see every quiet stranger you have ever underestimated. Caleb Danner's mornings began at 5 o'clock, long before the sun found the small house at the edge of a quiet Virginia neighborhood, in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and buttered toast, and the particular stillness of a home built around one man and one daughter. He moved through the house with the economy of someone who had once learned to waste nothing. Not motion, not water, not words. And by the time Tessa came downstairs in her school uniform, her father already had her lunch packed and her homework folders squared at the edge of the table. She asked him, as she sometimes did, why he still wore that old silver ring, its surface so worn that the emblem had nearly vanished into scratches and dull gray shadow. Caleb only told her it reminded him to come home, and Tessa, 13 and sharp enough to know when a door was being gently closed, let the question go. They drove together as far as her school in his aging pickup truck, the radio tuned low to a station that played nothing but quiet country ballads, and Tessa leaned her head against the window and watched the neighborhood slide past in gray morning light. Caleb never spoke much during those drives, but the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence built by years of trust, the kind that let a father and daughter sit together without needing to fill every gap with words. When he dropped her at the curb, she always turned back once, just to see him wave, and he always waited until she disappeared through the doors before pulling away. Then he continued alone toward the Jefferson Federal Conference Center, where he had spent the last 6 years keeping the doors, the wiring, and the cameras quiet and obedient. The National Security Conference was 3 days away, and the building hummed with the particular anxiety of an event that would host senators, 4-star generals, and the largest defense contractors in the country, all under one roof with the president himself, scheduled to attend. Caleb spent his morning walking the access corridors with a tablet in hand, checking door locks and camera feeds against blueprints he had memorized years earlier, and it was there, in a service closet behind the west stairwell, that he found something that did not belong. A small black module had been wired directly into the access control network, invisible on any official schematic, quietly logging every credential that passed through the building's doors. He reported it immediately to his supervisor, only to be told, almost dismissively, that Carrington Strategic Systems held the security contract for this event, and any anomalies were their responsibility to investigate, not his. Evelyn Carrington arrived at the center that same afternoon to inspect the preparations herself, moving through the halls with the brisk, assessing gaze of a woman who had inherited not just a company but an entire family's reputation for precision. She found Caleb kneeling beside an open panel, tools spread across a drop cloth, and assumed, without asking, that he was working outside proper protocol. She studied his work with the practiced skepticism of someone who had grown up surrounded by people who wanted something from her family's name. And Caleb, used to being underestimated, offered no defense of himself beyond a calm explanation of the wiring anomaly he had found. It was only when he stood to explain the irregularity that Preston Vale, the company's polished and ambitious communications director, noticed the ring on Caleb's hand and asked, with a thin smile, whether he had picked it up online somewhere. Caleb did not answer. His silence, to men like Preston, read as guilt, and guilt was a story too good not to repeat to anyone who would listen. That evening, after the last of the staff had gone home and the halls had gone dark except for the hum of standby generators, Caleb returned alone to the service closet and pried the strange module free from its housing. Etched faintly into its casing was a symbol he had not seen in 14 years, a small angular mark that had once something only to a handful of men who never spoke of it in daylight, men who had belonged to an operation that officially never existed. Preston did not let the matter rest. The following morning, he arranged a security briefing for the press corps covering the conference, and he made certain Caleb was standing at the center of it when the cameras began rolling. Caleb warned the assembled reporters and executives that the guest identification system could be accessed remotely, a vulnerability that could allow an outsider to move through the building undetected, and Sterling Wainwright, the company's polished vice president, dismissed the claim outright, reminding everyone that Carrington Strategic Systems had spent hundreds of millions of dollars on that very system. Preston seized the moment to ask Caleb, in front of every microphone in the room, about his military background, and when Caleb only confirmed that he had once served in the Navy, Preston lifted his hand for the second time and asked, loudly, whether every sailor in the fleet was issued a Navy SEAL ring these days. Laughter rippled through the crowd. A young executive murmured that the ring looked like something sold in an airport gift shop, and several guests exchanged the kind of smiles reserved for men they had already decided to stop taking seriously. Caleb stood perfectly still, through all of it, his jaw set, his eyes fixed somewhere past the crowd, the way a man stands when he has learned that arguing with fools only feeds their appetite. He had faced worse silences than this one, in rooms where the wrong word could cost a life rather than a moment of pride, and so the mockery of strangers who had never carried a weight heavier than a briefcase barely touched him. What did touch him, quietly and without warning, was the memory of Mason's voice telling him that dignity was never something other people could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. He held on to that thought the way he held on to the ring, and he let the laughter pass over him like weather. Evelyn did not laugh, but she did not stop it either. Instead, she quietly asked Caleb to remove the ring for the remainder of the conference, explaining that it might create confusion among the guests about his role. Caleb refused, calmly and without raising his voice, telling her that he would gladly leave the event if she wished, but the ring would not be leaving his hand. Sterling, watching this exchange from a few steps away, caught a glimpse of a small engraving on the inner band that most people would never notice, and something in his expression shifted instantly, though only for a moment. He quietly instructed building security to pull Caleb's employment file, and when the report came back nearly empty, listing only a handful of vague logistics years with no combat record at all, it only confirmed to the room that Caleb had been lying about who he was. He was reassigned that same afternoon to the basement technical level, far from the guests he had supposedly disgraced, and he accepted the demotion without complaint, the same way he had accepted every quiet injustice since the day he came home from his last deployment. There was a strange kind of peace in the basement corridors, away from the polished shoes and expensive suits, surrounded instead by humming machines and the steady, honest work of keeping a building alive. Caleb had learned long ago that the opinions of men who judged worth by appearance rarely survived contact with real difficulty, and he had stopped needing their approval sometime around the year he buried his brother. What mattered to him now was smaller and far more solid. A daughter waiting at home, a promise kept quietly, a system he could still protect even from the shadows of a basement no one bothered to look into. Once the halls had emptied and the lights along the upper floors had dimmed, Sterling retreated to his private office and placed a call on a line that had not been used in years. He kept his voice low, almost reverent with tension, and told the person on the other end that Danner was still alive and that he still had the ring. His hand trembled slightly as he spoke, an unusual break in the composure he had spent decades perfecting, and for a moment the mask of the polished executive slipped just enough to reveal something older and more frightened underneath. He had believed, for 14 years, that the ring and everything hidden inside it had been lost along with the man who once carried it. Discovering otherwise had rearranged every careful calculation he had made about his own future. And, as he ended the call, he sat alone in the dark office for a long while, staring at nothing, understanding that the arrangement he had built his fortune upon might finally be catching up to him. Caleb spent that night in the basement server room running a trace on the module he had removed, and what he found sent a current of cold recognition through him. The device was quietly transmitting data to a server registry marked Northstar 9, a designation that struck him with the force of a name he had spent 14 years trying not to say out loud, because Operation Northstar had once been the center of his entire life, and its ending had taken more from him than most people would ever survive. In the stillness of the empty room, the memory surfaced whether he wanted it to or not. 14 years earlier, a small team of Navy SEALs had been sent into a collapsing foreign capital to extract a group of stranded American officials, among them a young senator named Jonathan Hale, whose intelligence committee had unknowingly become a target the moment the mission's location was leaked. The extraction fell apart within minutes of contact, gunfire lighting up a street that was supposed to be empty, and Caleb had carried Senator Hale bodily through 2 collapsing checkpoints to reach the extraction point alive. One member of his team did not make it out of that city. The night had been thick with smoke and the smell of scorched concrete, tracer fire cutting bright lines through the dark above rooftops that had hours earlier held nothing more dangerous than laundry lines and satellite dishes. Caleb remembered the way Mason's voice had stayed level even as the plan collapsed around them, calling out directions with the calm of a man reading off a grocery list, buying seconds that meant everything with the currency of his own exposure. He remembered the weight of Senator Hale's arm across his shoulders as he half carried, half dragged him across open ground toward the extraction point, and he remembered, most of all, the silence on the radio afterward, the silence that told him, before anyone said a word, that Mason was not coming. When the mission was buried under seals of secrecy so absolute that even its existence would be denied for decades, Caleb was quietly given a stripped-down service record and told, without much ceremony, to disappear into an ordinary life for the protection of everyone who had been in that room. Returning to the present, Caleb understood with sudden clarity that whoever had leaked Operation Northstar's plans might never have been caught at all. He dialed a number he had not used in years, one memorized rather than saved, and after several rings a familiar, weathered voice answered on the other end. Admiral Marcus Whitaker did not waste time with pleasantries, warning Caleb immediately that he needed to leave the conference center because the gathering happening there in 3 days might be the target of something far larger than a data breach. Caleb asked him directly whether Sterling Wainwright's name had ever appeared anywhere near the Northstar files, and the silence that followed lasted a beat too long to be comfortable. When Whitaker finally spoke again, It was only to repeat that Caleb needed to leave immediately, a request Caleb refused outright, because hundreds of people would be walking into that building in 3 days with no idea what was waiting for them. Whitaker's warning stayed with him long after the call ended, circling in his mind while he worked through the building's systems alone in the quiet hours before dawn. He thought of Tessa asleep at home, unaware that her father was once again standing at the edge of something dangerous. And he thought of Mason, whose voice still echoed sometimes in the moments before Caleb had to make a hard decision. Digging further into the module's code that night, he discovered it was not merely collecting data. It was capable of remotely locking every emergency exit in the building at once, and a hidden countdown buried in its programming was set to trigger the moment the president stepped into the main hall. The precision of it chilled him. Whoever had built this had known exactly when the building would be at its fullest, exactly when panic would do the most damage, and exactly who would be standing close enough to take the blame when everything went wrong. The morning of the conference arrived with a formality that made the entire building feel like a held breath. Executives, generals, and government officials lined the grand hall in rows, each one waiting for the brief, practiced handshake that would mark their proximity to power, and Evelyn stood near the center of it all as the conference's principal sponsor, poised and composed in a way that suggested nothing was out of place. Caleb had been stationed at the back of the hall near the technical station, far from the guests he had supposedly humiliated with his lie, and Preston continued murmuring to anyone within earshot that the man by the wall was still pretending to be something he was not. When Caleb tried to reach Evelyn to warn her about the module's countdown, a pair of security officers stepped smoothly into his path and did not let him pass. The presidential motorcade arrived precisely on schedule, and President Jonathan Hale entered the hall to the practiced rustle of 100 people straightening their posture at once. He began the customary greeting line, moving toward Sterling's outstretched hand, and then, without warning, he stopped. His eyes had found Caleb standing at the far end of the room, and something in his expression sharpened into total focus. He walked past Sterling's still extended hand. He walked past Evelyn. He walked past 4-star generals and the wealthiest defense contractors in the country, and the entire hall fell into a silence so complete that the click of his shoes against the marble floor was the only sound anyone could hear. He stopped directly in front of Caleb, looked down at the scratched silver ring on his hand, and asked quietly whether it was still Mason's ring. Caleb answered that he had promised never to take it off, and the president took Caleb's hand in both of his own, holding it the way a man holds something he thought he might never see again. For a long moment, neither man said anything else. The hall around them had gone so quiet that the faint hum of the ventilation system was audible from the ceiling, and every phone in the room, every camera meant to capture handshakes and headlines, had turned instead toward 2 men standing in silence at the edge of a crowd that suddenly understood nothing about what it was witnessing. Evelyn watched from a few steps away, her carefully composed expression cracking just slightly at the edges, and Preston's mouth opened as though to speak before closing again, the words dying somewhere in his throat. Whatever story the room had told itself about the man in the gray uniform was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing left to do but watch it fall. Then President Hale turned to face the entire hall and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, that the man standing beside him had once saved his life and the lives of several others in an operation that could never be spoken of publicly, and that he owed this man a debt no ceremony could ever repay. When one flustered official tried gently to steer the greeting line back toward its normal order, the president said plainly that he would not be shaking another hand in that room until Caleb Danner had been treated with the respect he had long been denied. Preston's face drained of color, Evelyn stood frozen, the full weight of what she had asked this man to do, to remove the one thing that proved who he truly was, settling over her all at once. The president asked Caleb why he had come to the conference at all, and rather than use the moment to reclaim the honor stripped from him days earlier, Caleb simply said that the building's security system had been compromised. Sterling moved quickly to dismiss the warning as the overreaction of a paranoid veteran, and the president turned to him with a stillness that felt more dangerous than any raised voice, asking how he had known Caleb was a veteran at all, when nothing in the public record said so. Sterling had no answer, and in that silence, Caleb understood exactly what the man had just revealed about himself. The president ordered Caleb, Evelyn, Sterling, and Whitaker into a secured room away from the cameras, and there, for the first time in 14 years, Caleb told the story of Operation North Star aloud in full. The ring, he explained, had never belonged to him at all. It had belonged to his older brother, Mason Danner, the team's commanding officer, who had died holding the extraction line so the rest of them could get out alive. Before the mission began, Mason had pressed the ring into Caleb's palm and told him that if he did not come home, Caleb would have to live enough for both of them, and Caleb had worn it every day since, not as a trophy, but as a promise kept in silence. President Hale confirmed quietly that Mason and Caleb had pulled him out of a captivity that could have plunged the country into a crisis with consequences no one in that room wanted to imagine. Whitaker admitted what he had long suspected but never proven, that the team's route had been sold to hostile forces by someone inside America's own defense industry, and that the money trail led to a shell company later absorbed into Carrington Strategic Systems. Evelyn went pale at the revelation, insisting immediately that her father would never have betrayed his country, her voice thin with the effort of holding that certainty together. Caleb reached into the inner band of the ring and drew out a sliver of data storage so small it had gone unnoticed for 14 years, hidden there by Mason before the mission fell apart. A fragment Caleb had never been able to unlock because he lacked the key. Nathaniel Carrington, Evelyn's late father, had built the original North Star encryption architecture himself, which meant the decryption key might still exist somewhere in his private archives. Sterling suggested, a little too quickly, that the ring should simply be handed over to federal authorities for safekeeping, and something in his eagerness made Caleb refuse outright. The president agreed to let Caleb and Evelyn search her father's records together, under Whitaker's watchful supervision, and when Evelyn finally opened her father's private digital archive that evening, a single message surfaced on the screen before anything else. One Nathaniel had left behind years earlier. If Caleb Danner ever brings that ring back, do not trust Sterling Wainwright. Evelyn sat alone that night in her father's old study, a room she had rarely entered since his passing, surrounded by the leather-bound ledgers and framed commendations that had once made her so proud to carry his name. The archive took hours to unlock properly, each layer of encryption a reminder of how careful her father had been, how deliberately he had built walls around a truth he never lived long enough to reveal on his own terms. She found old photographs tucked between file folders, her father younger and standing beside men in uniform she did not recognize, his expression serious in a way she had rarely seen growing up. Somewhere in that quiet room, surrounded by decades of her family's carefully curated history, Evelyn began to understand that the version of her father she had grown up believing in was only part of a much larger, more complicated man. She spent the following hours combing through his sealed files, and what she found rewrote everything she thought she understood about her own family's legacy. Nathaniel had discovered, years before his death, an irregular payment connected to Operation North Star, a thread he had pulled on quietly, without ever gathering enough proof to act. He had suspected Sterling from the beginning, but lacked the legal footing to move against a man so deeply woven into the company's structure and for years Sterling had used an intermediary firm to sell classified defense data and manufacture crises, only to later sell his own company's security solutions back to the very government he had endangered. Nathaniel had died before he could finish building his case, but he had designed a final safeguard, a decryption lock that could only be opened by three things together: Evelyn's own biometric signature, the engraved code hidden inside the Navy SEAL ring, and a verbal authorization only President Hale possessed. Evelyn turned to Caleb and apologized for how she had treated him, and Caleb told her plainly that an apology would only mean something if she was willing to expose the truth, even if it cost her company everything it had built. She agreed without hesitation. When the three pieces finally aligned and the file opened, it revealed a list of hidden accounts, years of encrypted correspondence belonging to Sterling, the original leaked timeline from Operation North Star, and a new plan aimed at seizing control of the conference center's entire security system. The plan was not an assassination, but something colder in its calculation, a controlled catastrophe designed to frighten the government into signing an emergency contract worth billions of dollars with Sterling's shadow network of companies. One final piece of the puzzle remained locked, buried inside the building's central server on the technical floor below, and Caleb realized with sudden clarity that Sterling had engineered his demotion to the basement for exactly this reason, positioning him to take the blame the moment the system was triggered. As the thought settled over him, the lights throughout the entire conference center went out at once, and the heavy security doors along every corridor began sealing themselves shut. Somewhere beneath the panic spreading through the darkened halls, the building's backup systems had already been seized by an outside hand, and hundreds of guests found themselves trapped in separate wings with no clear way out. Sterling had vanished from the security office entirely. Preston, in a full state of panic, tried loudly to shift blame onto Caleb in front of any reporter who would listen, but the president personally granted Caleb temporary command of the technical response, cutting off any further argument. Caleb guided the security teams toward manual exit releases, careful to prevent the kind of crush that could turn panic into tragedy, while Evelyn used her authority as chief executive to grant him deep access into the very systems her family's company had built. It did not take him long to discover that Sterling was actively downloading files from the central server, preparing to erase every trace of what he had done, and Caleb moved toward the technical floor with Whitaker close behind him. Sterling had locked the doors ahead of them, but years of maintaining that building meant Caleb understood its bones better than anyone alive, and he guided them both through a service duct and a manual override panel that led straight into the server room. There was no gunfire, no violence beyond a brief, controlled struggle, only the quiet, contained tension of two men who understood exactly what was at stake. Sterling mocked him, sneering that a man who once called himself a SEAL was now nothing more than a repairman fixing broken locks, and Caleb answered simply that it was the repairmen who understood best which men were trying to trap everyone else inside. The server room was cold and close, lit only by the pale blue glow of standby indicators, and the air carried the faint electric smell of overworked cooling fans. Sterling's composure had begun to fracture at last, his voice climbing towards something closer to panic than command, and Caleb watched him with the same steady patience he had once used to wait out an enemy who thought silence meant surrender. Whitaker stood near the door, weapon lowered but ready, his eyes moving between the two men with the wariness of someone who had spent a career learning that the most dangerous moment often came after the shouting stopped. Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply told Sterling that the men who build the locks are always the last ones fooled by them. As Sterling attempted a last desperate deletion of the server's contents, Evelyn triggered a hidden backup system her father had quietly built into the network years earlier, and the data copied itself successfully just seconds before it could be lost forever. Security officers arrived and took Sterling into custody after a brief scuffle near the server racks, and just before they led him away, he said one more thing meant to wound, revealing that another member of Caleb's old team had worked with him from the very beginning. The name that surfaced from the recovered files belonged to a man Caleb had believed died alongside Mason on the night Operation Northstar collapsed. Derek Sloan, the team's communications specialist, had not perished in that foreign city as the official report claimed. He had instead sold the extraction timeline to Sterling in exchange for money and a new identity, and it was Derek who had planted the intrusion device inside the conference center, with Sterling only serving as the financier who profited from the chaos. Whitaker admitted quietly that he had long harbored suspicions about Derek's fate, but had never been able to locate a body to confirm it either way, and the admission carried the weight of a man who had spent years quietly, carrying a doubt he never voiced aloud, unwilling to reopen a wound that seemed, at the time, already closed for good. Caleb felt the particular, hollow ache of betrayal by a man he had once trusted like a brother, a wound different from anything Sterling or Preston could have inflicted. Derek was hiding among the outside contractors working the conference's technical crews, and his final objective was simple: to steal the recovered data and disappear before anyone connected the pieces. Caleb understood that Derek would eventually come looking for the ring itself, since it remained the only original proof of what had truly happened that night 14 years earlier. He offered himself as the one piece of bait Derek could not resist, a decision Evelyn immediately protested, reminding him that he had a daughter waiting for him at home. Caleb told her, without hesitation, that it was precisely because of his daughter that he could not let the next generation inherit a lie this large. Derek found him alone in an empty service corridor, and the two men faced each other across 14 years of silence and grief. Derek insisted that Mason had chosen the mission over protecting his own team, and Caleb answered that Mason had chosen to save people who could not save themselves. Derek tried, almost gently, to convince Caleb that burying the truth would protect the Navy's reputation, insisting that some secrets were kinder left buried, that the families of the dead deserved a clean story rather than a complicated one. Caleb told him that the families deserved the truth more than they deserved comfort, and that he had spent 14 years learning the difference the hard way. There was a long pause in that corridor, filled only by the distant murmur of the crowd still being guided toward the exit somewhere above them, and for a moment Caleb almost saw the young communications specialist he remembered, the one who used to make the whole team laugh before every mission. That man was gone now, replaced by someone who had traded his loyalty for a new name and a number in a foreign bank, and Caleb felt no satisfaction in what came next, only a tired kind of grief. Derek made one final, desperate lunge toward the corridor's exit, and a brief, controlled struggle ended with him restrained and in custody, unharmed beyond a few bruises. The last locked file opened cleanly, and it proved beyond doubt that neither Caleb nor Mason had ever caused the failure of that long Ago mission. President Hale told Caleb afterward that he intended to make the truth public, but he wanted Caleb himself to decide whether his identity should be revealed to the entire country. Whitaker believed this was finally the chance to restore honor to the whole team, not just to one surviving man. Evelyn, too, wanted the full story told, both to correct what she had done and to answer for what her family's company had allowed to happen under its name. Caleb refused to accept the honor entirely for himself, insisting instead that Mason Danner's name, along with the other loyal members of their team, be spoken before his own. He asked that the government publicly acknowledge the years it had allowed their families to live without ever knowing the truth, and the president agreed without argument. The days that followed moved with the strange, disorienting speed of a story too large for any single news cycle to contain. Cameras gathering outside the conference center each morning, reporters trading theories about the quiet technician who had stood beside the president. Whitaker worked through the nights compiling documentation that would finally, officially, restore the record of Operation North Star, careful to ensure that every name once erased from history would be written back into it correctly. Caleb gave no interviews. He answered no questions beyond what the investigation required, and each evening he still drove home to the same small house, still made dinner, still sat with Tessa over her homework, as though the rest of the world had not just rearranged itself around a decision he never asked to be part of. At the press conference that followed, held in a room far larger and far more crowded than the one where Preston had once mocked him, Sterling and Derek were named as subjects of a full federal investigation, and Carrington Strategic Systems pledged complete cooperation with every agency involved. She had spent her whole life being taught that power meant control, that a Carrington never gave up ground without a fight, and stepping back from the boardroom felt at first like losing a piece of herself she had never questioned. But standing beside Caleb during those difficult weeks had taught her something her upbringing never had, that some things were worth losing in order to keep. Evelyn voluntarily stepped down from several board positions to guarantee the independence of the inquiry, a decision that cost her influence but restored something she valued more. Preston had spent the days since the lockdown trying to make himself smaller, avoiding hallways where Caleb might appear, avoiding cameras that might ask him to explain his earlier comments. He had built his career on knowing exactly which way the wind was blowing, and for the first time in years, he had guessed wrong in front of the entire country. Preston tried to slip away quietly before the cameras could find him, but Evelyn called him back in front of the entire technical staff and asked him to apologize to Caleb directly. His voice shook as he spoke, the polish gone from it entirely, replaced by the flat, uncertain tone of a man realizing too late how small his cruelty had made him look. Caleb did not use the moment to humiliate him. He told Preston only that the apology mattered less than whether he would stop measuring a person's worth by their clothes or their title. The president then invited Caleb to stand beside him, as a long line of officials waited their turn to shake his hand, and for one quiet moment, Caleb removed the ring from his finger. He set it gently beside a photograph of Mason that had been placed on a small table nearby, and said aloud that the honor belonged to the brother who never made it home. President Hale was the first to bow his head before that photograph, and one by one, the room followed him. After the ceremony ended, Evelyn handed Caleb a letter her father had written years earlier and never sent. In it, Nathaniel apologized for not uncovering the truth sooner, and wrote that Mason had not only saved the president's life that night, but had unknowingly saved the Carrington Company from becoming a permanent tool for a traitor's ambitions. He wrote, too, that he had watched from a distance over the years as certain names quietly disappeared from public record, and that he had always suspected the cost of that silence had been paid by families who never understood why their loved ones came home changed, or did not come home at all. Reading those words, Caleb felt something loosen in his chest that had been held tight for 14 years. A small, unexpected urgency in discovering that at least one man outside the small circle of those who knew had tried, in his own limited way, to make things right. Nathaniel had left behind a private fund intended for the families of every member of the North Star team, one that had sat untouched for years, waiting for a truth that had finally arrived just in time to matter. Caleb did not keep the money for himself. He asked instead that most of it be used to support the families of the service members working in classified operations, to help veterans rebuild ordinary lives after extraordinary ones, and to fund vocational training for single parents who had once served in uniform. Evelyn offered him a position as the company's security advisor, and Caleb accepted only on the condition that frontline technicians would have a direct line to leadership, one that could never again be dismissed or ignored. Weeks later, Caleb came home to the same small house at the edge of the same quiet neighborhood, carrying the same ring, now gently cleaned but still marked by every scratch it had ever earned. Tessa noticed the difference immediately and asked whether everyone finally knew who her father really was. Caleb told her that what mattered far more was that people finally knew who Mason had been. The house settled into its evening rhythms the way it always had. Dinner at the small kitchen table, homework spread across the counter, the porch light flicking on against the coming dark, and none of it looked any different from the life Caleb had built long before anyone in Washington ever learned his name. That, he thought, was exactly how it should be. He had not fought to become a symbol. He had only ever fought to come home and to keep a promise made in a burning city 14 years before his daughter was even born. There would be no medals hanging on the walls of that small house, no framed photographs of handshakes with presidents, only the same worn ring on his hand and the same quiet life he had built one ordinary morning at a time. That, in the end, was the only monument Caleb had ever wanted, a daughter who grew up safe, a brother whose name was finally spoken with the honor it deserved, and a promise that had outlasted every lie told to bury it. In the story's final quiet moment, President Hale attended a small memorial gathering for the North Star team, held not in a marble hall but in a modest chapel garden lined with new stone markers bearing names the country had never been allowed to speak aloud until now. Reporters kept a respectful distance, and once again he walked past a line of people waiting for his handshake, moving instead toward the small family standing near the newest marker. This time he did not stop in front of Caleb. He knelt instead in front of Tessa, took her hand gently in both of his, and told her that her father had kept a promise to an entire generation, a promise carried quietly for 14 years by a man who never once asked to be called a hero.
Alright. Roundless up advancements, I'm not sure. No, it should say something about claiming spells or something. Let me think. I don't have to go back and get it. Oh, retrieve spirits. Thank you. Let's do it. Reignite. How do I make sure that's my guy?